Hello, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Seary. I'm the Executive Director of Teaching and Learning at Foundations, Inc., and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for another virtual edition of Perspectives from the Field talk show. Before I start, I really want to say a special thank you to the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for making this virtual talk show possible. Today, we're continuing our series on trauma-informed practice. And I'd like to welcome our host, White-Riley-Peterson Fellow Shawn Petty, and our special guest, Dr. Colleen Lelli, Director of the Center for Trauma and Domestic Violence Education at Cabrini University. Shawn and Colleen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you
for having us today. All right, I think that was our cue to begin. What do you think, Colleen?
That sounds like a plan.
Well, as Elizabeth, thank you, Elizabeth, by the way, for hosting us. What a great host and what a great group Foundations Inc. has been to host this talk show. So we do about 3 of these virtual editions a year, and we have a live talk show. And Colleen, you were at our last live talk show.
Yes, was.
So that was in Atlanta, right?
That's right. It was quite rainy, but it didn't matter because we were inside and we were having a great time.
So it's going to be wonderful. This year it's going to be all the way in Orlando, Florida.
I'm ready.
So excited.
I'm ready.
So Colleen's going to be joining us again in the live show because we're really expanding this whole topic of trauma-informed care. So very excited to have you. And as Elizabeth said, we are very grateful to the Charles S. Mott Foundation, not only for the talk show, but also for the fellowship, which I'm a part of, and for all the work that they do for kids and programs across the nation. It's really cool.
Absolutely. We can't thank them enough.
You know, we really can't. And Colleen, I'm not going to delve into your background because it's posted on the website and we've kind of talked about it. I know we have a ton of content to get through in about 57 minutes, so I'm going to let you just take it away. What are we talking about today?
Well, really what we're talking about today is we're delving in a little bit further into the area of trauma. We'll talk a little bit about trauma and about neurobiology regarding trauma, but then we're going to talk about domestic violence and exactly what domestic violence and how that can impact a child. Many times children are witnessing domestic violence, but they are in fact our victims as well. And so serving them as victims is really important, and really understanding the ways in which they are cognitively, behaviorally, emotionally, medically affected is really, really important for anyone who's really working with children in any type of lens.
All right. Well, it sounds like a jam-packed topic.
Sure does.
And is this something that you teach or you focus on, or what's your expertise in this background, I guess?
Sure. So I taught in the K-12 world, high school special education for a number of years, for about 8 years. And then I kind of started heading towards the higher education world. And so my area of expertise has really been special education and reading, and then taking those 2 areas and looking at children of trauma. Many times when I taught high school students, unfortunately, they would come to us what we would call, and we'll talk a little bit about later, complex traumas and how that affects them. And so for years, I've really looked at how trauma can in fact impact those children or those students in the classroom. So using my background in reading, using children's literature, talking about children's literature has been a way to really allow them to look at their feelings and be able to really express their feelings in a way that they haven't been able to because of the trauma that they've endured.
Interesting. So we've been saying the word trauma, and I'm just curious, like I get confused with terminology sometimes. What exactly is trauma?
So when we think about trauma, I'm going to move to the next slide. Oh, maybe not. See. Oh, there we
Oh,
go.
do you need?
I got it. Got it. So when we think about trauma, I mean, really, we have some terms here: an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury to the child or others, or a threat to the psychological or physical integrity of the child or others. I mean, that's the book definition, right? But really what has happened over the years is that trauma has, we've redefined it, if you will. So at one time when we were using the DSM-3, which is what's used to diagnose many folks with various psychological types of disorders, or if you will, psychological illnesses, those in that DSM-3, it was narrowly defined for really those who have been affected by rape and or those who have been affected in war. And so now we're using the DSM-5, and we've been able to redefine it and expand that definition. So being able to expand that definition has been able for us to recognize many other types of traumas that can affect somebody and the ways in which it can affect them. So really, I think that's why we're seeing a broader, not really broader, but I think we're defining it in the way in which it should be defined now. And so when we look at trauma, there's a number of traumas that we can talk about and get into that will, in fact, result in expanding that definition, but also expanding those services, hopefully, for those folks who need it the most.
Huh. Okay. So then what is, you mentioned also complex trauma.
So when we look at complex trauma, what we've done is, or I say we, and I'm thinking universally, but the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, Complex Trauma Task Force, they really recognize that we don't just have one trauma many times. We have what we identify as complex trauma. And so it's a term that's emerged from the recognition that many people experience multiple adversities over the course of their lifetime. So we're focusing on the impact of the events, not the nature of the events. So I might be in a car accident with you, and the way in which I have been affected would be different from maybe how you've been affected. And so recognizing that it is the impact of the event on the person, not in fact the nature of what happened, is really important. So when we're with children, we recognize that a lot of times we have families and they may be going through a trauma. Maybe somebody in the family has cancer. And so the way one child in that family may react versus another is really important for us to recognize the way in which we are treating them and understand that we need to be trauma informed. And so it's really important, again, for us to recognize how it affects each person individually.
So I have to ask this because part of my job is to ask those questions that get brought up, and sometimes as we work in the field, we're like, oh, don't ask that question. But here it is. Is it really that important to focus on the differences between different traumas? So for example, something happens to a family. One child experiences that event in one way, another child experiences. Can't we just say, suck it up and deal with it? Or, now realize I'm asking this as a question. It's not necessarily my personal belief. So for everybody on the line, don't start throwing things in the chat room on me. But I'm just curious. A lot of people have that question. They're like, pull the phrase here in Texas is like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, suck it up, deal with it. I'm able to deal with it. Why can't you?
Right. So I think that what needs to happen is that we have understanding now about how trauma does in fact affect the brain. And because it affects the brain and affects everyone differently, we need to have that understanding. And I think that what I try and explain to my pre-service teachers is that really students, a lot of times, children are just looking for that one person, that one lifeline, that one person that says, I'm sorry you're going through this. I understand you're going through this. And then talking them through and helping them, to your point, be resilient. And how do we get them to be resilient? And so I think that sometimes that takes a little bit more of training, a little bit more self-care and teaching them self-care and what that means. But not, again, giving them a pass for everything by saying, well, I have this going on. But instead, okay, well, what is your plan? Let's talk about the plan to get you to where you need to be. If you think about, all of us as adults, we go through life with plans, right? All right, well, we wake up, and then what are we going to do next? So teaching them those skills are life skills, really. And so giving them those life skills. But going back a little bit to the neurobiology. So when we talk about the brain, really, trauma is toxic to the brain and body. And so we're learning now through research and by looking at MRIs, the ways in which the brains are different in regard to trauma. And so we know that trauma, or what we call toxic stress is very similar to trauma. We can get into that in a minute, but it really damages what we call the architecture of the developing brain, and it can lead to a weakened foundation, and it can lead to circuits, if you will, in the brain being changed. And so it's really important for us to recognize that. Now, with that said, we also need to recognize that we can't just throw up our hands and say, oh, well, my brain's different. There's ways in which we can use strategies, innovative strategies, to support somebody who has had a weakened system. And Nadine Burke-Harris, she would say that there are ways that we can get to a point of training. Also, there's a book by Sowers and Hall that I reference here. It's about building resilient learners, and what does that look like, and what do those strategies look like? And so we can, in fact, do that in the classroom, and I should say outside the classroom as well, with just the understanding of how, in fact, the brain works. And just a little bit more. So if we look here at neurobiology and trauma, we now know that there's areas of the brain, for instance, that it's called Broca's area. And Broca's area really is the part of brain that inhibits language. It's responsible for language. So when we have folks who are in a trauma and they're having difficulty expressing their feelings, we know that that's Broca's area that may have been affected. And again, there are ways and strategies that we can use to support them so that they can get to a place of using their language in a way that's productive.
Wow, so you're saying that like intense trauma at various ages could actually stop someone necessarily from developing their language ability, their skill set.
Yeah, and so when we think about the brain and when we think about expressive and receptive language, really that involves a lot of what we do in school. And so I think it might be, a little while later, I'm going to talk a little bit more about expressive and receptive language and how they're affected. And then I'll talk more specifically about the strategies that can be used. But then, when we look at trauma and we think about domestic violence, that's huge. Domestic violence, we have 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims of some form of other in domestic violence. Physical violence, it could be an intimate partner within their life. It doesn't necessarily have to be a marriage. And so it's really important for us to recognize how domestic violence can impact a child as well. Unfortunately, when we look at abuse, a lot of times people think about, when we think about abuse, they think about just physical violence, but there's many different types of behaviors and abusive behaviors. There's physical, emotional, mental, sexual, spiritual, social, and economic. And I think the other myth and another really important point we have to remember is that it really afflicts persons of all socioeconomic categories and cultures. One of the myths out there is that, oh, well, this is this domestic violence only happens with poor people, and it only happens with people of this certain particular culture, and that's really in fact false. So we need to have an understanding, because these children are coming from homes all across SES and cultures, and we need to have an understanding of how domestic violence can in fact affect them.
Can I ask a question about that? And
Sure.
I apologize, my internet apparently recycled, so I dropped off and jumped.
I thought it did. That's okay. I kept
You just
going.
kept going. That's great. So is domestic violence or systematic abuse, is it always done by one person, or can it be done by multiple people?
So yeah, that's a great question. So when we talk about domestic violence, we're looking at one person and the way one person is abusing another. Now, there is a term that's usually an umbrella term that can be called family violence. And under family violence then is domestic violence, child abuse, elder abuse. And so really domestic violence is that systematic abuse by one person, and they're usually in an intimate relationship, because some of the controlling behaviors that are used in domestic violence may be different than some of the behaviors we might see with child abuse or sexual abuse or elder abuse. And so domestic violence tends to be a little bit different, because if you take a look here, I'm going to go ahead one slide and just look at the power and control wheel. The power and control wheel really exemplifies the different behaviors in ways in which domestic violence relationships could go. So this really was started in Duluth, Minnesota by Ellen Pence and her folks. And Ellen Pence, what she did was she talked with abusers as well as the victims. And she said, tell me all of the behaviors that you have either used or you feel like you've used, or to the abusers, and then to the victims that you feel have been used to you. And so they looked at using intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, using the children, minimizing, denying, blaming, using male privilege, economic abuse. So all of these pieces are really about power and control. And so when we look at these pieces, I'm going to go back one slide here and just back up. It's really important for us to recognize that 1 in 5 children are exposed to intimate partner violence each year. And so 90% of these children are eyewitnesses to this violence.
1 in 5 children?
5. So you have 30 children in a class, let's just say. You're going to have, what is that, 6 kids? If I'm doing the math right?
Yeah, 6 kids.
6, right? Depending.
Right.
So, yeah, you're going to have a significant amount of children. If you look, the Massachusetts Advocates for Children, now, although this is from 2005, unfortunately, and I do have an updated stat, and I apologize for not putting it in here, but the updated stat is no different. It's just an updated year. Really, it's still the same, 3.3 million, 10 million, depending on the pockets and the research there, have witnessed violence in their own home each year. So it's huge.
And that's kids
and so,
observing violence, like
right.
in their house or in their intimate settings where they're supposed to feel safe
Right.
and secure. They're observing some type of violence to their parent or guardian. And you said in the last slide, I think I was off for that, but is it mainly women or men?
Yeah, so there's a stat here that it's 1 in 3 women, and then it was 1 in 7 men, but from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the updated stat is in fact 1 in 4 men have been victims of some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. Physical violence could include throwing, it could include hitting. And so when we talk about domestic violence, it's important for us to recognize, too, that we're talking about systematic abuse. So it happens often. Sometimes partners will have what we call marital discord, where it's an argument. But it's not systematic. It's not occurring often. And so in that case, it's not necessarily domestic violence. And again, we're not seeing these patterns of behavior of from the power and control wheel when we're talking about domestic violence versus marital discord. Marital discord, you may have an argument, you may have a disagreement, but we're not seeing these repeated systematic behaviors frequently. And so that's important to note too. I don't want people to come away with this thinking that anytime there's a marital discord or argument that it in fact is domestic violence. That is something unrelated and different.
How interesting this wheel. I'm looking at it and I'm just amazed at some of the things here. Like, I can't, I'm reading the giving her an allowance under the using economic abuse. I cannot imagine giving my wife an allowance. Like, I mean,
right, I know.
She would go ballistic. Or abusing a pet is intimidation. How
so interestingly enough, a lot of times women will not leave, and I say women just because that's who I've done the most research involving gender-wise. A lot of times women will report that they don't want to leave. You know, that's been a hashtag, right? Why won't they leave? So they say then why they don't leave, and sometimes it's because of pets. They have to leave the pets behind with the partner, and they're afraid of what the partner will do to the pet. Or, you know, that they don't know where to go with the pet. And so when women, in fact, are in domestic violence relationships, it's really important for them to check with their county resources. We do, a lot of times there are county resources that will support them. So recognizing who they can speak with, and you know, finding out who's our support system in our county or in our community is really important. And so I do want to note that this wheel was done in the 80s and 90s. And so some have tried to update it, and what the Duluth Project has said is, while that's great because now they include cell phones and tracking devices are sometimes placed in phones and on cars. So that's important to note. But the reason that they have not, in fact, changed their wheel themselves is because this was the original research. And so I think that that's really important for us to note. So there might be other wheels that are floating around, and they might be great tools, but they may not be based on research. So I just wanted to make sure that that's noted. I had a colleague one time say, "Oh, I found this great new wheel," and I had to explain it may be useful, and it might be useful to note, but please, I encourage you to do it alongside of the original power and control wheel, because this one was based on research.
And so how do you use the wheel? Is it an awareness piece, or does it lead into doing something, or what exactly is the wheel besides informing us? I mean, obviously it's a lot of powerful information and things, you know, that we may or may not be aware of.
Right. I think it's important to note that, especially when we're faced with somebody who may have been in a domestic violence relationship, and you're going to have to, again, do this carefully, and I can't possibly train you in an hour because there's training regarding counseling, and I'm not a counselor either, but talking with those victims. But understanding that, you know, if you feel that a loved one has mentioned these to you, or maybe they've come to you and they say, I think I need help, you know, recognizing how many of these behaviors they have faced themselves, and then again finding an agency or finding a counselor who specializes in domestic violence to help support you and the victim to get help safely. That's really important. They say that it takes a woman 1 in 7 times, or a victim 1 in 7 times, before it'll take 7 times before they will actually leave. 7 times. And that's because they have children. They have money that is connected that they cannot get themselves. They're worried about the pets. Speaking about the children, many times they feel if it's a cultural thing, or if they've been told it's a religious thing, a religious piece where you need to stay with me, this is what we believe. So they won't leave because of their beliefs. So it's really important for us to recognize that there are cultural aspects of this, but there are ways to get them support. I'm on the board of it's called Laurel House. It's in Montgomery County, where I live in Pennsylvania, Montgomery County um, based agency. We service all of our county. And we just had our gala last week, and we had a woman, and she came and spoke. And she was from India, and she spoke about how she was afraid to leave and why she was afraid to leave. And then finally, she did get up the courage. But she did, in fact, reach out to our agency and another agency to support her in doing so, because we want to make sure that they leave safely and that they are able to leave without there being further incident of crime and or, God forbid, death. So it's really important to recognize the safe way and to have a safety plan in order to leave.
I can only agree. You know, I mean,
I know. So I have a couple other slides. I think I hit a lot of them, but I think to bring it home, it might help to talk a little bit more here about, again, we just talked about seeing, right? And so you were asking that. And I think here, this is really important too. They also, when we talk about exposure, so they might be directly observing, they might be hiding in their room or in their closet, so they're overhearing. Maybe then somebody leaves and they come out and they find the aftermath. They might find the victim, direct victim, with a lot of bruising and cuts and crying, emotionally distraught, and then broken items. Also, they may become an additional target. So the child themselves may then face child abuse as a result of the domestic violence that's occurring. And then maybe police come and they intervene, and there's medical attention, ambulance, hospital, fleeing to safety. So these are all the things that we mean when we say that a child is in fact exposed to domestic violence.
I like the fact that you include, well, not like the fact, I respect the fact that you also include overhearing. I have sometimes had people be like, well, you didn't observe anything, you didn't see anything, but yet the child, like you said, was locked up in a, or not locked up, but locked themselves in like a secure location, but they could hear everything that's going on. And I think that's just as traumatic as viewing it. That sometimes their imagination is even worse, Although the whole situation's bad, I'm glad that's included in there because it's something that, I think happens a lot. In the chat room, one of our guests shares that many times young kids will disclose information when they're in the after-school program or in the informal learning program. And so what do we do? I mean, we're not, many of the after-school care providers, we're educational professionals, youth development professionals, but we're not counselors or social workers always, and we're not quite sure what to do when that happens. Any advice?
So if a child comes to us and tells us that they are in danger, right? And if we feel they're in danger, then of course we have to call Childline and we have to make sure that we report that. We are mandated, well, check with your state laws, but I believe most states now are, if you're a teacher or working with children, you are a mandated reporter. However, if you're not sure, maybe they made a comment and you're not absolutely sure, you probably should still report it. You should also maybe connect with whoever is your supervisor. That's really important. If you're not sure about like what is my role, you need to always check with your supervisor and get their support and find out what it is you need to do. The state of Pennsylvania, we've had a real big push here. We are mandated reporters. And so a lot of that and a lot of our laws have changed. It used to be we reported to our supervisor. But as a result of what happened with we had a big Penn State Sandusky scandal. And so it was made national news. And so as a result, we are mandated reporters. And so what I'm about to say, I hit that home first. And that's absolutely what you should do. With domestic violence, and this is why I encourage everyone to get additional training, sometimes you are putting them at more risk if in fact it's reported. Because if the person who is the abuser gets wind, they could then do more harm. So that's why I stress to make sure that you get more training and that you go to your domestic violence agency and ask them what they suggest you do. It's really important to understand and unpack all of the issues regarding domestic violence. It can be very, very tricky. And so that's why it's important to get more training, and it's important to recognize the effects that it can have.
Thank you. And that was a tough question. I put Colleen on the spot there, and I apologize.
It's honestly a tough answer, and every time I'm asked it a lot. I try to answer it the same way because I just want people to understand. I don't want people to not report, but I also want them to report and understand what could happen too. And so it's really important that if you don't feel they're in immediate danger, of course, if they have bruises and if they have and you've seen a lot of bodily harm, you have to report that. But if you feel like they're overhearing a lot and they're not saying themselves are in immediate danger, you have to kind of figure out where to go with that. I also know in our state, our agencies where we report Childline, they are inundated with phone calls, and sometimes it takes a while for them to get to the phone calls and to get to the bottom of it. So if that's the case, sometimes you can call another agency and get some quick advice before calling Childline. And so that's something that I would, sometimes recommend if they feel that would help.
I appreciate that, and I asked that tough question because this talk show today is all about awareness. It's about bringing folks to the awareness that trauma is happening and that domestic violence is causing major trauma with youth, and we're kind of introducing you to it. But as Colleen, Dr. Lelli said, it's important to receive additional training and don't just walk out and be like, hey, I had a 1-hour webinar. I now think, this. It is important to go out and get additional training, follow your local policies, your state policies, and then it goes up from there. But what we're really focusing on is bringing awareness to youth are being exposed to various domestic violence, which is causing trauma, and it has an effect on that youth, right?
That's right. And so if we take a look at the next slide here, we kind of touched on it a bit, but what we might see is developmental delays. We might see behavioral and emotional problems. So we might see students who are really exploding, behaviorally out. They are really showing us they're angry, or they might be very hyperactive, or we might have some who are more internalizing those behaviors and who are more quiet. And so it's really hard to say, I see this behavior and it's definitely domestic violence going on. Instead, my hope is after you leave this webinar, you think, some of these behaviors I've seen, we're really quick to judge and say ADHD. But then if we take a step back, it could be some type of trauma. And so the way in which we can recognize that is, again, just getting to know our students. That's really important. Also, we might see some other cognitive type of and social problems as well. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those in a few minutes with expressive and receptive language. We might also see defiance. We might see others engage in what we call parentified behaviors. So if you're in an after or before care type program and you have siblings, you might see a sibling who's taking on a parentified role. It's called parentification. And so they're trying to be that parent. One time when I was working at Laurel House and I was working with children who have been affected by domestic violence, and the moms were coming for counseling, and so we would work with the children. And so I saw a child, and I'll never forget the age because at the time my child was about the same age, 8 years old. And the child, a young boy, was putting on the hat and putting on the coat of his baby sister, who was about 2. And he was saying, "It's cold out there, let's put your hat on. Oh, let's zip up your coat." And so he was taking on that role of a parent. And so we might see that now. We might see that anyway. I was a big sister, and I to this day love that role. So you might see someone taking on those roles anyway, but have those roles changed? Are they more engaged? Are they asking more questions about maybe, did my sister do their homework? Did my brother do their homework? Did they, can I check their lunchbox? Did they eat today, right? Or, what's in their book bag? So you might see these roles that are becoming more intensified. And so that's something that might trigger, okay, there might be something going on here at home, and domestic violence could be one of those things. Or we might see them pour themselves, a child by themselves, pouring themselves into activities that they love. Sometimes our type A personalities, believe it or not, may be going through something in home. We might see more anxiety. They might be more anxious. So what is that doing, and how are they affected in their schoolwork? So it's important for us to see exactly how they're reacting, and then recognizing what in fact could occur. When we talk about academic performance, let's look at this next slide here. We know that this could pose a huge hurdle academically. I have one research study here, but there's been multiple that have found that maltreated children, or children who have in fact witnessed domestic violence. I'm writing a book right now, and I just finished reading an article, and it's all about domestic violence and reading, and how reading is in fact impacted by domestic violence. So we know that their cognitive skills could be impacted. And so we know that.
That just sounds kind of like common sense, though. I mean, forgive me for being just like that common person, I guess you would say. But if a kid's scared or worried about what's going on at home, it makes sense that their academics would drop. But I am interested to find out that even reading is affected, because I almost sometimes, and this is just my own lens that I'm using, but I see reading as kind of a, me in the book type of activity, and I use it, I personally use it like as an escape, so to speak, like to go away into worlds of fantasy or mystery or whatever for a second, and then get back to work, so to speak. So you're saying that even instead of using reading as an escape or as a way to get away, it actually can affect their reading, where they may not want to do it, or they may not be interested, or...
So what can happen actually is it really affects the areas, again, of the brain. So when I talk about reading, right, reading is just one skill that we need when it comes to language. So we have expressive and receptive language. Expressive is speaking and writing, and then we have receptive is listening and reading. So let me talk a little bit about reading first, since we went down that path, because like you, I'm an avid reader. I love to read. I just actually, I will be on a sabbatical in the fall at Cabrini. So I have a stack of books that I've started that I'm going to be reading, and I'm super excited about that because like you, it's an escape. For some students, they can't connect necessarily with the characters that are in the books or in the stories. A lot of books that are written are books that are, there's this somewhat normal problem, if you will, right? Normal problem, and we have to resolve the problem by the end of the book. Unfortunately, children who are in complex trauma situations or in domestic violence, which again is systematic abuse, it's complex trauma because it's occurring over and over again. I should have probably mentioned that earlier. So therefore, they're going to have difficulty saying, hey, I'm reading this book and the main character is Junie B. Jones. And Junie's just like me. She has difficulty at home too, but really her difficulties are more about school and the stinky school bus, and they're somewhat wonderful, if you will, and really should be the type of problems our children deal with. But unfortunately, we have children who are dealing with domestic violence, and these are real problems. So trying to find books that they can connect with the storyline can be somewhat difficult. And so not only is that difficult, but then you take into the account all of the different ways and the different, for lack of a better word, different mechanisms that we need to use to read. Those are in fact impaired. So for example, when we're looking at memory and we're trying to take in everything we're reading, put it into our short-term memory, and then recall it so that we can make meaning of what we just read and comprehend, students are going to have difficulty with that recall piece and bringing in that memory. So reading can be very difficult for them, and quite frankly, if it's an arduous task, it's not something that's pleasurable then.
It's interesting that you mentioned, finding reading material that's likened into their life. Like, who wants to read about the princess who finds a prince who slays the dragon, who goes away and lives in a house of gold, for the rest of their life when they're going back to a very traumatic situation. So
that's right.
I can understand that.
That's right. And it can be hard to find, and that's why it's really important to connect with counselors to find out what books would be helpful for them, not books that you can read in a whole class setting or a whole group setting. You want to be careful you're not doing that. But there are books that you can use that talk about feelings, and then that lends itself to the expressive language piece where they're having difficulty finding the words to explain how they're feeling. So speaking and writing can then be difficult because they're having difficulty finding those words. And so it's really important for us to support them in that endeavor as well.
It's interesting. We use I attended like a conference workshop a while back, and I learned about flash fiction or microfiction, like writing short stories in like 350 words with a twist. And I will say secondary students here in Texas, we've used it, and they really get into it. I just read one that was like a boy raising a chicken, but he got hungry, and he's like, wait, where's my chicken? And, implying that he ate his chicken. But I've seen some of our programs here start to use flash fiction to build this expressive speaking and writing. And what's interesting is the stories are fictional, but they have a really strong link to what's happening, or it seems to be what's happening in the student's life. Have you seen that too?
Yes, I think that, what's interestingly, sometimes I think you need a lot of strategies, right, to find what's going to work. So I think a strategy like flash fiction is certainly something that could help students to express themselves. What might be difficult then is if they express something and now you have it in writing, you're going to have to figure out a way, right? What am I going to do with this now? But I think it's important to try it. The other piece that I've suggested trying, which may be in a later slide, and if it's not, I'll just say it now, using content area literacy, so social studies, science, and math, for ways for students to express themselves rather than just journal writing. A lot of times kids don't want to do journal writing because they don't want to talk about themselves, and they're afraid they might reveal something that they don't want to reveal. So something like flash fiction, like you talked about, right, would be very helpful because it's fiction. It's right. It's not about them, and so that could be something that they feel comfortable. Then I'm writing a story. It's not about me. Whereas again, journal writing is usually about themselves. So it's helpful to sometimes incorporate something like, today in social studies we were learning about World War II and General so-and-so. Tell me what you would do. We've learned a lot about him. What are some questions you might want to ask, and how do you think he might respond? That way it's something connected to what they've learned, but not necessarily about themselves.
Interesting. Interesting. So we're sitting at about 15 minutes to our time frame, and we have a couple of more slides, so I'll let you dig right into it.
Okay, sounds good. So some of the difficulties that they may have in terms of reading and writing is they're going to have problem-solving confusion. So a lot of times, again, I was talking about that problem solving. They may not be able to empathize with the character in the story, but they might also have difficulty with verbal problem skills themselves, because if you're in a domestic violence home, you obviously have not been taught, probably, I shouldn't say that. Chances are you may not have been, is a better way to say it, taught problem-solving skills. And so they're going to have difficulty with problem solving in reading text, like narratives, like stories. They may not have the skills necessary when they're in the classroom to work through problem solving. So they're really going to need some support with that.
Okay.
We might also see information processing skills, like I talked about before. They can't necessarily categorize information or pull information from what they've known previously to support them with what they're reading. So that background knowledge may be a little bit hampered as well. And then that heightened anxiety that you talked about, Shawn, right? So if their anxiety is already heightened, just being able to focus is going to be difficult. So not even talking about the other cognitive disconnect that may be occurring, but just that emotional piece and not being able to come off of that fight or flight type of mentality is going to be really, really difficult for them. So I think I'm wondering if I froze or Shawn froze. So I'm just going to keep going. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can use children's literature. So children's literature is a great way to talk about what is going on with them. So, okay, I think Shawn may have froze. So one book here that actually there's a bunch of books here that you can use in a full group setting. So there are some books that you could use that deal specifically with the topic of domestic violence. Of course, you don't want to use them in a group setting. One book that you might want to be able to use is When Sophie Gets Angry, Really, Really Angry. Hi, Shawn. I see you're back. That's good. So when we talk about anger issues and when we talk about how they feel, it's really, really important that we talk about other words besides angry, right? So one book that we can use is When Sophie Gets Angry, Really, Really Angry. Talks about frustration, talks about other terms that children may not be familiar with. Another book that's not here is a book called, and I'm thinking about it, it's called Today I Feel Silly, and Other Feelings or something or other, and it's actually by Jamie Lee Curtis.
I read it to my daughters at night.
It's great because at the back it has a little dial, and I should have held it up here. I don't have it real close to me, but it's a great book to talk about different types of feelings, right? And so kids, a lot of times, they don't have the words, so giving them the words is really, really helpful. Coming into a program every morning or afternoon saying, how do you feel today? Sometimes I've seen it where they have a board and they can say red, green, or yellow, and it helps to talk about regulation, self-regulation. And so that's a way to teach resilience and perseverance, is being able to say, I feel this way, but I can hopefully get through it and get some support today. Some other books that are great here, Have You Filled a Bucket Today? I talk about that book a lot, and it's getting to a point now where everyone knows it, which is good. That's bringing awareness. It talks about what it means to be nice to people and fill their buckets. And then, what does it mean to be a bucket dipper? So bucket dipper is when we're mean to somebody and we're bullying them. And so how can we make sure that we're filling up somebody's bucket? And so, interesting story, when my daughter was young, they were using that book at school, and my husband said something not so nice to me one day, and my daughter said, "Daddy, stop being a bucket dipper." And my husband said, "Okay," and she walks out the room, and he turns to me and says, "What is a bucket dipper?" And so I had to tell him about this book, and he said, "Oh, I'm glad they're teaching them that. Now I know to watch myself." I'm like, "See, you learn something new every day." Um, the other book here that I want to point out that's a little bit more emotional is A Terrible Thing Happened. So in that book, A Terrible Thing Happened, it talks about the raccoon, the main character, Sherman, I believe his name is. He's talking about all of the terrible things that has happened to him and what's going on at home and how it's affecting him in school. So somebody who's having difficulty at home could connect with this character because they're recognizing, they never really say what the terrible thing is, although it does allude to violence, and so it alludes to a little bit to domestic violence. So that's a book that, in fact, you could read maybe to more of a group setting or something that has happened, maybe relatively speaking, within the after-school population where we can all talk about this terrible thing that happened to all of us. So there's a lot of other books here that talk about other issues like, unfortunately, death. Two Homes, that's divorce. Jenny is Scared. I think it's just when terrible things happen, so that's more of a full trauma book. Spaghetti and a hot dog bun talks about a young girl who has curly hair and is being bullied because of her curly hair. So there's a number of Invisible String. I also believe that's about when somebody moves away from somebody else or there's death involved. Ways to still connect to that person. So using children's literature is a way to talk with children about the issues they're facing. It's a way for counselors to connect. And if you're comfortable in a counseling situation, but you may not be counseling, but support from a counselor, you could then support the student and build that relationship. Again, sometimes it's that one lifeline, just that one person that says, I'm here for you. That is all what the child needs.
I love it. These so usually when we do webinars, we don't really disclose a whole lot about ourselves, but I will share. My daughter has anxiety disorder. She has a sensitivity to things, and so we use a lot of these books just to bring awareness. Because while she does hopefully live in a loving, supportive home, she has that stress and that anxiety, and she lives in flight or fight type of. She lives in that world, so we have to. And this was hard for me to learn. I had to be careful because I was one of those individuals who's like, suck it up, get out there, go play soccer, do this, just walk in the room and go speak, and that really is debilitating for her. So we've been able to use books like Jenny is Scared, and we've used the Jamie Lee Curtis book, we've used Have You Filled a Bucket Today, plus the adult version of How Full Is Your Bucket, so
Right.
This is great, and I love the fact that it's resources that we can introduce to our programs, to our fellow staff members, and to our families as well. Because while we have highlighted domestic violence, there are many other forms of trauma out there, and literature, powerful books, and a caring person can be an amazing benefactor.
Yeah. And I think exactly, and to your point, when it comes to literature, your daughter, when you're using literature, she's now seeing characters who are similar, so they don't feel so alone. They don't feel like it's just me. It's not just you. There's a lot of people out there that are faced with difficulties, and what's important is how we face those difficulties and what we do with what's given to us. And that's really important, too, for them to recognize.
All right, well, we are in our last 5 minutes. I think you have some references to share with some folks.
Yes, I think I do. So I think what I have here is just these references. These are just all of the articles that I have used. One of the Here's the Sowers and Hall book is here, Fostering Resilient Learners, Strategies for Creating a Trauma-Sensitive Classroom. That's a great book for understanding ways in which we can use additional strategies. Again, I didn't have much time today. Another great book is Helping Them Heal by Peterson. That's another great book to use with young children. If you're interested in learning more about reading and writing and ways in which our brain works, Sally Shaywich is great. I know it's Overcoming Dyslexia, but she explains the way in which our brain is used in the process of reading. So that would be really, really helpful too if you're interested in that. And I think I just have my information here. I'm willing to do any trainings in regard to trauma and or domestic violence. So if you have any need, please feel free to reach out to me. If you get my away message stating that I'm on sabbatical, I am still answering my emails or passing them off to the good folks who are helping to run the center. So that is something that I just wanted to share with all of you, and I believe there's some additional slides after this.
Yeah, before I jump into the next slide, though, I'm going to go back to your last slide just so that everybody can have your information. We have a couple of questions that have popped up, and we have a few minutes, I think, to address. We got about 4 minutes before we need to wrap up. Everybody on the line, if we do go a little over and you have to leave right at 1 o'clock, we fully understand. We're just very grateful that you're here and that you've been able to listen to this material. The webinar or the show is recorded and posted up on the Perspectives from the Field webpage, which is on the Beyond School Hours website, so you can see it there. You can also see Dr. Lelli live at the Beyond School Hours Conference 2020 in Orlando. So very excited. Some of the questions that we have, let's see here. So one of the questions we have was, what about parents who indicate that they're not sure what to do, but they know they're angry, that like they have an anger issue?
Well, I think that it's great that the student, so they're recognizing that the child has the anger issue or the parent themselves?
They're self-recognizing. They're recognizing that they have an anger management issue.
Okay. Well, that's even, again, recognizing is always the first step. So I think what I would say to them is, congratulations, that's awesome that you can recognize, right? Whenever we can recognize who we are and how we can make ourselves better. And I think I would just encourage them, great, so it sounds like you want to make yourself better. So let's try and find, again, community resources. I encourage everyone, if you have the time, or not, I know finding time is the most difficult piece, but making a book that shows all of these are community resources that that you can use in our area. A lot of times when I talk to people, they don't even realize, for instance, oh wow, we have a comprehensive domestic violence agency in our county. And I say yes, and our agency, in fact, isn't just a shelter. It offers counseling, financial assistance, legal assistance. So recognizing that that's your first step. Your first step is understanding that I need some support. So help me, and knowing how we can help them is all the better. Then, so getting them to those support services
off
is
of
really
that,
important.
This is a little different take, but it goes to the books and resources. Is there anything for middle school?
Yes, I do have other book lists that I've created and that I'm continuing to create. There are some books out there, chapter books, but I'll be honest, there's not as many. So anyone out there who has the writing bug, that would be a great thing to write for fiction. So for middle school students. But I can tell you with my high school students, I did use children's books. They balked the first time I used them, and then they were all in, listening intently. So I highly suggest you try and use children's books too, because that sometimes will help them to understand. And telling them, yes, I know that this kid may not look just like you, but isn't that something that it's a kid and you're in middle school, and if a kid is going through this and you're going through this, let's talk about ways we can help you get through it. So I think
Excellent.
that's
Well,
a piece of
I am
you
going
can
to
use those literature
move forward a
pieces
little
as
bit.
well.
We are at time, but oh my goodness, can I just share again, Dr. Lelli, Colleen? It is always fun to chat with you. I was sharing everybody on the show today. I was sharing that we first had our very first interview about a year and a half ago, I guess, and I was interviewing Colleen, and I basically asked her a couple questions, and she introduced me to the whole concept of trauma. She introduced me to an individual, excuse me, named, I'm so sorry, but well, I had a soccer game the other day, so I've been losing my voice.
It happens.
But it's just been,
Oh no.
gosh, if it's not my internet, it's my voice. I'm so sorry. But it has been a pleasure, again, because you introduced me to this field, you introduced me to this concept, and it has just been great. So, hey, Paula, can I ask you to jump in and kind of talk about the last two slides?
Thank you
It
so
looks like I'm
much.
losing my voice. Paula does not have a microphone, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. Oh, before I lose my voice, but we are continuing this show. I apologize, everybody. We are continuing this show, and our next topic is going to be building upon the work that Dr. Lelli has shared today around trauma and how domestic violence affects it, but she did also go into the impact trauma has on the health of a child. So on September 11th, on Patriot Day, we are going to ask Dr. Dana Long some more questions about this. We're going to talk about health disparities in childhood trauma. We're going to talk about the social and environmental factors that contribute to it, as well as those youth that are underserved. So we did mention a little bit about, trauma can affect anybody. It's not linked to your socioeconomic status. However, underserved youth that don't necessarily have community resources readily available to them or strong support systems can experience true health disparity, and that's what Dr. Long is going to talk about. So our link to sign up for that is there. Also, you can get continuing education credits while you're here. It looks like I'm getting my voice back. Yay, so sorry. We had a soccer game the other day, and I'm the coach, and so I was like, blah. And I woke up this morning taking herbal tea and everything so that we could do the webinar. But what I was going to say to everybody there is it has been a pleasure working with Colleen. She introduced me to this topic. She introduced me to Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is the first official Surgeon General of the state of California. It has been such a pleasure working with you. I look forward to continuing our conversation at the live show, but I also hope you'll join us at our next webinar on September 11th, and I hope everybody on the line will join us as well. Don't forget, thank you to the Charles S. Mott Foundation who sponsored this talk show, and don't forget about Beyond School Hours in beautiful sunny Orlando, Florida at the Caribe Royale Hotel, February 26th through 29th. The link to register is over there in the web link page. We also have links to the Laurel House and the Jordan Center for Children of Trauma and Domestic Violence. And we have a survey. We would like to ask your feedback on where the status of our shows should go from here. So again, thank you so much for everything. I will stay on the line for a little bit to answer questions, but I think we can let Dr. Lelli go off to her sabbatical.
Thank you.
Have a great
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Shawn.
Thank you, everybody. If you do have any other questions or you need anything answered or want us to address a question, I think we have a hand up in the chat room. You can put it into the chat function and we'll try to answer it for you. I am going to stop my video here. All right, well, it looks like no one has any more questions. It looks like everybody's kind of heading out to lunch or to the next activity. So on behalf of Foundations, Inc., the Charles S. Watt Foundation, and myself, I would like to thank you for joining us, and I hope you all have an amazing day. Take care, and we'll see you next time.